So a very warm welcome to everyone to this afternoon's session. My name is Lynn Kuok, and I'm the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Affairs. I'll be moderating this session for the next hour or so. We have a firm stop at 1:30, so let's get going. But before that, please allow me a personal note. So I was a Munich Young Leader in 2013, and so I'm really delighted to be back here again today. The Munich Security Conference and the Kerber Foundation have really been wonderful in investing in their young leaders, and I think I am joined by all the young leaders past and present when I say that I am tremendously grateful to you, the teams of the Munich Security Conference, as well as the Kerber Stiftung. Now, joining me today to discuss managing security relations in Asia are a sterling group of panelists. Let me begin on my far right with introductions. We have Dr. Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, Minister of External Affairs of the Republic of India. Next to him is Mr. Toshimitsu Motegi. He's Japan's Foreign Minister. Next to him, Reynolds, Senator Linda Reynolds, who's Minister of Defense of Australia. And we have, to her left, Senator Robert Menendez, ranking member of the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And to my immediate right, Mr. Mark Rutte, Prime Minister of the Netherlands. So let's begin with you, Minister Jaishankar. We heard from Foreign Minister Wang Yi a little while ago, and he painted China's vision for the region. Now, of course, the United States and its allies, including the Quad members who are all represented on this panel, also have their own vision of the region, and that's the notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, India has been identified as the key player in this free and open Indo-Pacific. Do you think, you're welcome, do you think India has the capabilities and the willpower to do what it takes to promote the rule of law in the region?
Short answer, yes. Long answer. Look, I think today, what's very clear, even from the theme of the conference, is that the world's looking at a lot of uncertainty, largely because different parts of the world are changing in different levels of magnitude. So what is it that India can do in this situation? I think partly it can bring greater capability to bear, assume greater responsibility. It can play the role of a stabilizing force in international politics. It can, in many ways, given its history, its positioning, its relationships, it can serve as a sort of a bridge between different conversations and different narratives. And because the session is on Indo-Pacific, and I'd be happy to talk about why I think Indo-Pacific is relevant, what's the logic behind Indo-Pacific. I mean, to my mind, there was historically an Indo-Pacific. For various reasons, we didn't think of it that way. It's now come back into play. What the Indo-Pacific at the end of the day is to look at the Indian Ocean arena and the Pacific in a more integrated way. Historically, the people who used to look at it, there was in political science and international relations in the 1930s and 40s, some thought of Indo-Pacific, but as a Eurasian, as a continental concept, not as a maritime concept. Today, the focus is maritime.
Exactly. So let me stop you there, Minister.
So let me just give you an ending remark there. When you ask me what can you do, what we can do on the maritime side, what we are doing on the maritime side today, for example, are more white shipping agreements, which are very important for security. We've done 17 of them. We have 19 more in the pipeline. We provide naval assistance. We have given patrol craft to 8 countries in the Indian Ocean. We have helped to set up coastal surveillance radar systems in 6 countries. We have done 7 HADR operations in the last 5 years of significant size. We do 3 annual HADR exercises in the Indo-Pacific. We do about $2 billion worth of defense credits. And we do a lot of hydrographic cooperation as well. So we do bring something to the table.
You seem to bring a tremendous amount to the table. I mean, you highlighted the importance of the maritime space in this Indo-Pacific concept and the linkage between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as one strategic operating theater. I want to talk about India's maritime strategy. You have your 2015 maritime security strategy, and in that strategy, you identify the Indian Ocean as the priority theater and the South China Sea as a secondary theater of operation. Is that going to change? Are you going to raise up the priority level of the South China Sea, or is India really more of an Indo power as opposed to a Pacific power?
I think I would update the thinking from 2015. Today, I would urge you to look at it more in terms of concentric circles. I think the central circle is obviously the Indian Ocean, because we are located there, we are the fulcrum of it. That's where most of our immediate interests lie. Then think of it as larger circles. I mean, I think the eastern end, the western end of the Indian Ocean obviously are important for us. And then look at the Pacific as well. I mean, look, more than 50% of India's trade is towards the east of India today. For us, Japan, Korea, China, Australia, among other countries, are our major trade partners. So I wouldn't limit it to where it was in 2015. I think our thinking has evolved beyond that. But obviously, geography and economics does mandate that the Indian Ocean is the core of our interests.
You mentioned economics, and I'd like to address that. Prime Minister Modi actually surprised everyone last year in November, I think, when he withdrew from the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You have justified his decision on the basis of domestic imperatives, and you've also highlighted that 12 out of the 15 members of RCEP have free trade agreements with India. Now, all this makes sense, except for ASEAN countries, unfortunately, don't see it that way. And because we have no ASEAN member states on this panel, allow me please to introduce some of their thoughts, and I'd like you to respond to that. So from the ASEAN perspective, they saw it as, first, a wasted opportunity to strengthen India's strategic engagement with ASEAN. Second, diminishing India's image as a consequential strategic partner. And third, undermining the Indo-Pacific concept because it failed its very first test to join the geographic spaces of South, Southeast, Northeast, as well as Australasia. What are your comments, please, and very quickly, sir?
Well, look, the RCEP was an economic agreement. It was a trade agreement. When you try to sell a trade agreement on non-trade arguments, maybe there's something wrong with the trade side. So think about it. So what was the issue? Why did we hold back? We held back because, frankly, the offers which the others gave us on the merits of the trade negotiations were not good enough. Now, you can't say, oh, by the way, we can't give you enough on trade, but it's a lovely strategic logic, so why don't you sign up? Finally, the numbers have to make sense. The numbers didn't.
Looking now at numbers and more economics, Japan, Mr. Motegi, I'll turn now to you, and I think Mr. Motegi will be using the translator to speak after his early remarks. So if you could keep your devices handy, please. But Mr. Motegi, before the US revitalized the Indo-Pacific concept, Prime Minister Abe actually was the very first person who actually sought to enunciate a sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. And he did that in 2007, indeed, presenting before the Indian Parliament. And in that, he called for India, as well as fellow democracies, to join hands in keeping the Pacific and the Indian Oceans free, safe, and open. So I would like you to please to address the sort of challenges that Japan was sort of responding to in coming up with that free and open strategy. which is now called its vision. But could you please address the sort of challenges that Japan saw in its backyard, as well as why and how the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy fits into those challenges?
Thank you very much for giving the floor, Dr. Kuok. 最初に申し上げたいのは、
First of all, let me say that on RCEP, we still have time before we come to a final conclusion. My good friend, Minister Jaishankar, said just now that as far as Japan is concerned, and for many countries in Southeast Asia, would like to see RCEP achieved amongst the 16 countries, including India. That is what we are aiming at, and we would like to deepen our discussions towards this end. Now, you also mentioned Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. Japan was the first to propose this idea, and this concept has been shared by countries in Asia and by European countries as well. So this concept has been widely shared. And basic values, such as democracy, rule of law, these basic values, countries are sharing these basic values, looking at the area of Indo-Pacific from Pacific, Indian Ocean, and this leads to Africa. This encompasses almost half of the global population, and it is at the center of the global growth and free economic activities and safety of navigation, freedom of navigation will have to be ensured. And for those who buy into these all the countries who buy into this vision should participate to enhance connectivity in the region and to enhance the vitalities of each economy, to develop infrastructure and to nurture human resources. And Japan is committed to exert leadership in trying to achieve this.
Thanks so much. Talking about enhancing connectivity in the region, Japan has actually been probably one of the most forward-leaning countries in the region in terms of seeking to help countries develop their infrastructure and more broadly their economies. I believe on the latest figures that Japan way surpasses China in terms of infrastructure development, showing a sort of understanding of the region that for the region, economics is security. That said, I think China has been reported to be fast catching up in terms of infrastructure development with its Belt and Road Initiative. Is Japan worried about its ability to shape the way it wants the region to look moving forwards without this economic tool?
As for Japan, strengthening connectivities, it is not just building the infrastructure. That is not the only thing we are thinking about. We need to think about 3 different types of connectivities. We need to improve on all 3. The first is quality infrastructure to be developed. More specifically, the ports and harbor, railways, roads, energy, ICT, and others. The improvement of physical connectivity. So I'm sure you will be able to have a good understanding, but there are 2 more important connectivities. One is education, the occupational training, as well as the human resources development, the human connectivity to be improved. This is the second aspect. Japan, through the official development assistance, not just assisting the manufacturing, but also the soft side, the know-how and expertise that we have for operating systems are also been transferred so that infrastructure could be utilized to the maximum in the host country. Those are the things that Japan is always exploring. And thirdly, as a minister myself, I have been promoting the EPA and FTA, the common rules setting to be promoted. And the CPTPP is the one an example of this. And with the European Union, we now have Japan-EU EPA. We are now also promoting RCEP within the Asian region. The institutional connectivity through rules making and harmonization. We need to improve institutional connectivity as well. What is important is to think about long-term development of the host country. What we are providing should be genuinely in support and contributing to that. The openness, the debt sustainability, transparency, and also the transparency to be promoted. We have always promoted at the Osaka G20 summit on the quality infrastructure, G20. The principles have been agreed amongst the G20 leaders, and consistently, not just providing the money and funding in creating physical structure, but Japan has always tried to support creation of jobs locally and train the human resources and to have sustainable economic development to be realized. From a long-term perspective, we have always provided assistance to the communities.
Thank you. I think, in fact, Japan's efforts in the region have been well appreciated. On a recent survey that the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies did, it found that, in fact, more than 61% of respondents from the region actually thought that ranked Japan top in terms of the country being able to do the right thing. So, well done. Senator Reynolds, turning now to you. I think we've heard parts of conversations about the challenges the region faces. Some of these have been of the more traditional kind, but there are also gray zone tactics. And I think recently you gave a speech in Washington, D.C., where you actually highlighted that challenges are not always of the more traditional kind, but also gray zone challenges. Could you please tell us how Australia has been facing these challenges, as well as your own difficulties as defense minister of a country that's quite economically dependent on China? How have you managed to balance the different interests?
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. And I think to understand Australia's strategic situation, you've got to understand our geography and our history. We are a three-ocean nation, the Indian, the Pacific, and also the Southern Ocean. And we enjoy great relationships, and we always have, both with ASEAN and also with the Pacific Island nations. We have had for many decades a very strong and close relationship, economic relationship in particular with China, and we have a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. But as has been discussed here, and just previously by the Chinese minister, we do have strong economic relations, but we also have differences. We have different cultures, different societies, and different histories, and different perspectives on many things. But that has not stopped us having a very strong relationship economically, as we still do today. But for Australia, the Indo-Pacific is our home. And we look at the shifts in both the Indo and the Pacific. It is both regions becoming increasingly contested, and also local countries becoming more anxious, as we've heard here in the NATO countries and in Europe. So for us, our traditional relationships and friendships and strategic partnerships are very important with the United States, with many of the NATO countries, and also, of course, with ASEAN. But we're facing, as a reasonably small nation, a large continent, we're facing many challenges on the strategy front. We confront terrorism in our region and as part of the global coalition. We're facing new militarisation in our region, which means that we have to face new challenges in terms of emerging technologies. But we also have to face, like I think most countries, is a realisation that there are many incursions on our sovereignty that fall below that threshold of kinetic activities. So Australia has been very forward-leaning in terms of looking after our sovereign interests, and we see many things that arguably seek to erode the strength of our democracy. It's everything from cyber security, cyber attacks, potentially on on infrastructure, critical infrastructure, on political parties. We see foreign interference with our political parties in our system, making use of social media in terms of attempting to influence public opinion in Australia, one way or the other. We've also taken very strong stance now on foreign interference in our universities and our university sector. As I said, in politics, we now have very strong laws for foreign investment, but also we're looking at new challenges, which we've worked with people, a number of countries here, including my two colleagues on the panel, and that is on critical minerals. Who controls and who stockpiles critical minerals that we all need for modern technology, for renewable energies, etc. So there are many fronts to interfere very pervasively, and so we are very alive to that. Mm-hmm. And again, we call it out when we see it, because ultimately it is another way of interfering with our nation's sovereignty and those of other nations in our region.
You mentioned the many fronts by which sovereignty can be interfered with. Has it been difficult, though, to bring the public along with your assessment of threats? And for that matter, has it been difficult to get your allies to agree on the perception of threat? Because I understand that it wasn't just the United States that was red-hopping mad with the UK's decision on Huawei, but apparently Canberra didn't take it very well either.
Well, look, in relation to 5G, I think Australia has taken a very forward-leaning approach globally, but our approach is not focused on one specific nation. It really is that we've taken a stance on the protection and the integrity of our 5G as we move forward into our 5G networks. We see very little, if no difference, between what is in the core of a 5G system and the periphery, and the technologies that enhance and support that whole system. So where we see that there might be a decision or companies that are not in our sovereign interest, then we are taking a very strong action. Again, it is not aimed at any particular nation. It is really just standing up and taking a position in our sovereign interests.
Thank you. Senator Menendez, you've spoken before the United States Senate a hearing on Hong Kong and the Indo-Pacific, and you've said that the Trump administration, though you agree with the Indo-Pacific policy, the Trump administration has yet to show that the Indo-Pacific policy will make the United States more competitive rather than just more confrontational. How would you do things better?
Well, thank you. Look, I think, first of all, sometimes, as it relates to the Indo-Pacific, we pose the question as the choices between the United States and China. I think there's a different choice. The choice is between international law and the rule of law. Yeah. The choice is about human rights and democracy. The choice is about an international free trading structure. The choice is about the law of the sea versus irregular actions. And so, from my perspective, we need to be, as a Pacific nation, we have very significant interests in the Pacific, we need to be engaged in strengthening regional architecture. We need to be engaged in not tariffs, but international trade agreements. We need to be engaged in strengthening ASEAN and other institutions and participating and working with them in meeting the challenges of the region. We are doing more with India, for example, in the maritime space. When I was in India recently, we went to the Western Command, and we saw how U.S. and Indian naval operations are taking place in the interest not only of our two countries, but others within the region. And so my view is that we need to be, one, more fully engaged, support regional architecture in terms of some of these institutions, work with our allies to strengthen these institutions, because some of them, because of historical purposes, have been not willing to take the challenges of the region and become more than somewhat of a debate society. And I understand the historical reasons for that. But now, in this new reality, it seems to me that if the region wants to assert itself, then it has to rethink about, for example, some of the structural issues that ASEAN and others have had. And then lastly, I think that we need to think about, yes, China has 1.5 billion people, but if you look at the Indo-Pacific region, and it brings to power through organizations and structure nearly 2 billion people with some of the most dynamic economies in the region, that's an incredible center of power. Helping to catalyze that, I think, is incredibly important.
I'd like now to turn to the goals, in fact. Actually, maybe this would be the right point to raise a question from the audience. I still have further questions for you, Prime Minister, but instead of my question, I'll ask this question by Espen Barth Eide. Is there a danger that the current US-China tension eventually leads to a division of the world economy into two spheres? Are we approaching the end of genuine globalization? So a bit of a weighty question in the middle of the panel, but I'm sure you can handle it, Senator.
Well, I do not believe that it needs to be so. At the end of the day, I not only believe we need to confront China, but more importantly, we need to compete with China. And so how we compete is incredibly important, not only for the United States, but the entire region. But what we seek to create is a rules-based system. Now, China has different views about that rules-based system. It has maybe different claims, for example, in the South China Seas that creates irritants. Fine, let it file its legal challenges in the appropriate venues, not to ultimately seek the bumping of naval ships in the waters, not to throw your airplane over the middle of the Taiwan Straits, not to challenge your Vietnam last year in its exclusive economic zones. Those are not within the international order. So we welcome China to join in an international order that is rule-based, that supports free and open trade, that ultimately engages in the rule of law, that observes human rights and democracy. These are the underpinnings of an economy just not for economic sense, but that strengthen the broader goals. And if China wants to be part of that order, we welcome it. If not, if it seeks to be outside of that order, then we must recognize it as such. And it seems to me that I suggested before, when you have nearly 2 billion people in the Indo-Pacific joined together with some incredible regional economies, that there is a great opportunity for that to be an advancement, not just simply a division between East and West.
Maybe later during the Q&A, I'd like to turn now to Prime Minister Rutte. Your parents actually lived in Indonesia before you were born. I think I've read about quite charming stories of your childhood where Indonesia held a sort of magic for you, and you recounting your mother's nasi goreng. So it was really a lovely tale. But of course, your interest in Indonesia and the region are not just personal. You made a trip to Indonesia last year. Could you just share with the audience what Dutch interests in the region are, and perhaps also what middle powers, European middle powers like the Netherlands and like others, can do to step up the game in Asia?
Well, certainly there is that historical connection between my country and Indonesia. And it is also a very personal connection because of my family history. But I think what we're discussing here today is broader than just that. And it goes back to what Senator Menendez was just talking about, some of our values, like free trade, the law of the sea, human rights. And I think all of us on this panel believe that we should somehow uphold these values. And my plea is that to do this, we have to work together. We have to work together, not only the middle powers, but the European Union, all the countries in Europe, the Americas, of course, the United States as an important power there, the most powerful country in the world, and the countries in Asia. And why is this necessary? Because these values, gentle as they are, have to be defended in an uncompromising world. And it is not that easy. At this moment, we live in the times of the big men who have bilateralized multilateral relations. And for us to be able to incentivize, again, the multilateral organizations like the WTO and NATO, the EU, ASEAN, and of course the UN itself, we have to invest. We also, and this goes back to what the Foreign Minister of Japan was saying, we have to invest in our infrastructure. Particularly, I think, in Asia, this is crucial. Because infrastructure in many countries in Asia is still lacking behind. There we can help. America and Europe and Asia together, we can work on infrastructure projects in the region. And finally, I have had numerous discussions with Obama about his pivot towards Asia. And I said, don't do it in this way. Not just the US and Asia. Make sure that you anchor that pivot in a strong transatlantic relationship with Europe. Because collectively, the three of us, the EU, Europe, America, and Asia, we are much stronger together to work on this pivot than when it is just the US trying to build that relationship with Asia. And we have seen the free trade agreement, which had been designed under Obama. It is now down the toilet. I do believe that we have to do this collectively. But my main plea is that in this world where multilateralism is so much under pressure, we can constantly bash China, bash Trump, and whatever. It doesn't make any sense. At the end of the day, what we have to do is work together and make sure that these multilateral organizations are again functioning for the benefit of us all. And the plus of Trump, I think, is that by having him on the world stage criticizing these multilateral organizations, it should give us a reason to invest again in these organizations with his help to make sure that we reform them.
You talk about institutions, but can we also expect to see a greater Dutch defense and security profile in Asia?
Well, what we are doing is first of all, we have to have a bigger defense and security profile within NATO. Because there's another issue, we are not spending enough on defense. So we are pumping up our defense spending in Europe. And of course, also in the future, we will have a strong presence of the US through NATO in Europe. But yes, of course, we also have to invest in our relationships in Asia, including military. Not Asia itself, but for example, the French initiative now in the Strait of Hormuz. The Netherlands is participating with a vessel to make sure that that important strait, that part of the world in which so much trade is happening, that it stays open. So we have decided to not only give political support to that initiative from Macron, but also to give a military, to have a military presence there. And I think we have to do more of this in the future. I was in Australia in October, hosted by Scott Morrison. And I had extensive talks at the Institute, the Foreign Relations Institute in Sydney. And what I saw is how Australia is trying to get a grip on its relationship with China. So many Chinese students being active in Australia, so many issues in that relationship, and at the same time, China as a crucial factor in that region and an important partner for Australia. And I felt also there that collectively we can deal with these challenges much better than when we are on our own.
And yet, we saw harassment of a Dutch royal shell drilling operation off the coast of the South China Sea. So I think in some cases we can possibly rely on multilateral action, but in other cases, perhaps that might come too slowly.
Yes, well, of course, as also the Senator was alluding to, the law of the sea and the UNCLOS and what we have collectively designed as a system is crucial to deal with these tensions. And we very much call upon every country to de-escalate the tensions in that region. But of course, from the Netherlands to try to solve that issue from that distance, being a middle power, is almost impossible. Mm-hmm. There we have to work in a collective fashion.
I'm glad actually that you brought up UNCLOS because, of course, modern international law of the sea stems from the great Dutch scholar Hugo Grotius. Yeah. And so, while I hope to see, if not more military or security presence from the Netherlands, I hope to see more emphasis, perhaps the Netherlands playing a more prominent role in terms of supporting UNCLOS. I would like now to turn to questions, please. If you could just raise your hand and grab a mic if anyone has any questions.
They all agree.
They all agree. With who? If no one has any questions, I would like to ask the next question. I believe at the Raisina dialogue in January, which I was present at, Mr. Jaishankar, you mentioned that if there was any relationship that you wished were better between bilateral relationship between India and another country or region, it would be India and Europe or the European Union. Now that you have one member of Europe here with you, what would you propose you would like to do together to further promote stability and the rule of law?
I mean, there was a context in which I said it. I mean, I'm happy I said it. But if I were to look at the major poles of the international order, I would say, to me, one which is currently underperforming is the one between India and Europe. There are a variety of reasons for it. Part of it is that India historically has treated Europe more in terms of its individual states than the collective European Union, but we are changing there. So at this time, what we would certainly like to see, I mean, Europe collectively is India's largest trade partner. Europe collectively is India's largest investor and is also, by the way, largest investment destination. There are a number of European countries, including the prime ministers, where we would be among the top external investors in the local economy. But what we would like to see certainly is an upgrade of that relationship. One, we did some years ago attempt to negotiate a free trade agreement. It didn't work out, but I think today people are quite open to that. The second, which interests me a lot in the current context, is whether actually we have better, stronger, more forthright security conversations. We haven't had that perhaps as much as we should have. So that too is an issue. But there are other big challenges in the world today, challenges of, say, connectivity, challenges of technology, which you raised, challenges of norms, laws, how do international organizations run or don't run. I think there's a lot out there which should be a conversation between India and the EU. And I'm actually really happy that immediately after this conference, I'm actually going to Brussels, and I would be attending a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union on Monday, and I look forward to doing that there.
I'm not always happy to go to Brussels, but I'm so happy that you're happy. No, but that was a joke. I agree with you. I agree with you. We should do more. The Netherlands is the second biggest trade partner for India in Europe. And in the European Union, we will be number one when the UK, well, the UK has left, but at the end of the year, they will also leave probably at the end of the year, will also leave the systems of the European Union. And what I have sensed over the years in my dealings with Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, and other politicians in India, is because of that trading relationship, you then start to discuss the other issues, the region. India has a large influence in the region, and of course, up to and including Afghanistan, knows what is happening, tries to influence the course of events, including, of course, security cooperation, fighting terrorism. All these issues we have to work on closely together. And the only way to do it, and it always starts, almost always starts with a strong trading relationship. And from there to discuss standards and norms, and from that to find out that we work collectively on these values and how to maintain them.
And on the note of values, I think I would like to ask Minister Motegi, we've heard a lot about human rights and values in this forum, but perhaps I hear about it less in my part of the world. And in fact, when someone was recently questioning the dearth of references to human rights in national security documents from the United States recently, I was told by a Japanese diplomat that in fact indicates the triumph of Japanese diplomacy. So I was a bit surprised to hear that. But I think what I took away from that was that Japan might have a different way of thinking about human rights. Perhaps it's important, but maybe we should be speaking less loudly, but more privately. I wonder whether you could share your thoughts on how we should be thinking about human rights in a time when there's increasing strategic competition.
First of all, including the issue of human rights in the international community, in the country-to-country relationship, who is the winner and who is the loser. That concept in itself, I believe, is quite wrong. How to create win-win situation is something we need to think about in the security arena, as well as in terms of trade. This is a type of thinking which is quite important. Earlier, there was a question raised as to how do we regard the US-China relationship. US and China both are responsible powers, not in confrontation, but to work together on the various issues, including the North Korean situation, as well as the regional situation and the world economy. And that in itself is important. Therefore, I welcome the agreement between US and China in terms of the first phase of its trade agreement. Now, Japan-US alliance is the cornerstone of Japanese democracy, of the diplomacy, and under the strong Japan-US alliance, Japan and US are working very closely for the regional issues, including our relationship with China. Looking at the Japan-China relationship, we now look at a very stable relationship, including the frequent, the summit level, the communications and the visit. At the same time, there are still pending issues, and through the summit as well as the foreign ministerial meetings, so we are repeatedly raising these issues. What we need to assert must be asserted, and we strongly continue to ask China to take a positive response. This is not just about Japan, but for the international community, what we need to assert to China need to be asserted. For example, early this year, I visited the Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and those the East Asian, the ASEAN countries. The situation in the South China Sea seems to be worsening. So, including militarization of the disputed features, the attempts to unilaterally change the status quo will threaten the regional peace and the security, and which may have significant impact not only on Asia but for the international community as a whole. For South China Sea issue, Japan would like to continue to strongly oppose any unilateral attempt to change the status quo and the coercion to any other countries. Non-militarization and UNCLOS should be the norm. We will strongly continue to ask for peaceful solution of the conflicts. And furthermore, the COC should be effective and substantive and centered on the UNCLOS, and also agree with the international law and the stakeholders' legitimate rights and the interests for those users of the South China Sea must not be undermined. This is true for the other countries, but for Japan, our relationship with the United States and our relationship with China are not in a zero-sum relationship. With China as well, we will deepen the necessary cooperation, and China on economic issues as well as on human rights issue. What is required from the international community, China needs to dispense with this responsibility. We should work with China and strongly ask China to behave in a responsible manner.
Talking about asking China to behave in a responsible manner, how is the US faring in that respect? Is the game over, you think? China has built all these islands in the South China, features huge islands in the South China Sea. It's militarized them in the blink of an eye. Is the game over for the United States? Because we've also heard over the weekend, I believe, that the Philippines is asking for a cancellation of the visiting forces agreement with the United States. How is that going to affect the US forward presence in the region?
Well, first of all, no, the game isn't over. Secondly, we look forward to working with the Philippines, which has been a long-time ally in resolving whatever differences they are and continuing to have a critical relationship, not just for us in the Philippines, but for the region. But if I may, following on the distinguished minister's comments and your question about human rights, the reality for the Congress of the United States and the United States Senate, human rights and democracy is critically important. If you're a Uyghur in China, you want us to be casting a light upon the oppression that those people are facing. If you are oppressed in North Korea in a slave camp, you want the international community to be casting a light. If you're in Venezuela and ultimately having to flee, over 1 million people have fled Venezuela, creating an incredible challenge in the region, you want the world to be focused on that. So I understand quiet diplomacy, but I also understand that there are times that we must commit ourselves to a recognition and to challenge those in the international order who violate the basic decency of human rights, democracy, and particularly the international recognition on human rights. And so sometimes those private statements do nothing more than an acknowledgement. The public statements, however, create a challenge to that nation to try to change the course of events. Same thing with human trafficking. And so I think it's incredibly important to continue to have that on the agenda and in a very public way.
Thank you. Another thing that's really affecting human security has been climate change. Senator Reynolds, Australia has a Pacific Step-Up program, and I understand that Pacific Island states cite the #1 security threat as not China or the United States or any other big power, but climate change. How has Australia fared in helping the Pacific Island states feel more secure in the region?
Well, in a number of ways. We have a very close relationship with the Pacific nations. 2 years ago, we started what we call the Pacific Step-Up program because we realised that we are a Pacific nation and we have very close bonds and friendships with nations right across the Pacific. But to be honest, our attention had drifted away from the Pacific for a while when we're focusing on counter-terrorism in the Middle East and other issues. So we have engaged in new ways with Pacific nations. To be a good friend, to be present in the region, to listen nation by nation about what our friends want, how do we help them solidify their own security, their prosperity, and also how we can help them have others respect their own sovereignty. Clearly, if you are a small nation in the Pacific, where you've got like one or 2 feet of clearance, you are very worried about climate change. We are working very closely with the Boy Declaration with countries across the Pacific in terms of resilience, in terms of infrastructure as well, and becoming more resilient. But we are very acutely conscious. We are doing a lot in Australia. I think sometimes we get unfairly criticised for our environmental record, but we are not only meeting our Kyoto targets, we are exceeding them, and we are absolutely on track to meet and beat our Paris targets. We are one of the world's per capita biggest investors in renewable energy and technologies, which we are again sharing and working with our Pacific neighbours on how they can do that. But again, it's not just in climate change, it's also plastics in the ocean and other sort of important environmental issues which disproportionately impact on our Pacific neighbours.
Thank you. And finally, the last question, since we are here in Europe. Is Asia the answer to working more closely with the United States and better ties?
Is Asia the answer to working closer?
Closer to the United States and closer to transatlantic ties?
I believe it's both. I believe we have to anchor again the US in a relationship with Europe and Europe in a relationship with America. And to do that, it's crucial to explain again to the Americans. And I know that we don't have to explain this to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because they know this very well. But the general public, that the US is not only involved in NATO because of some historical reason, but because there is a direct self-interest. If this part of Europe would be under Russian influence, Russia would have access to an economy bigger than the US economy. Now the Russian economy is as big as the Benelux, but then it would be bigger than the US currently. So there is a direct vital strategic interest for the US to stay anchored in that transatlantic relationship. Also, of course, for all the other reasons, our values, our democracies, but also in a very strategic way. At the same time, I'm absolutely convinced when we want to deal with the big issues in the world and take indeed environmental challenges. For example, China. China is in Asia on the forefront at this moment in many instances on fighting climate change. And particularly because there is a societal pressure to do that. and we have to make use of that fact and work with them to make things happen. But then, and therefore this panel is so timely, I do believe the Quad countries and Europe and other Asian countries working together, and not just Asia and the Americas, or the Americas and Europe, but the three of us is the only way to really invest again in the structures you need to underpin that, which have been depleted in the first 10, 15 years of this century. And we have all sung the hymn of multilateralism. I do the same. But let's acknowledge the fact that all these organizations have been underinvested, are not functioning, and then somebody certainly comes to the stage and says, hey, they are not functioning. And should we abandon them? No, we shouldn't. But we should again restart them. Give them a kickstart again. That's crucial to deal with these big issues. And I think that's what is unifying us on this stage, unifying Asia, the Americas, and Europe. And therefore, I'm so enthusiastic about this cooperation.
Thank you so much for that very strong rallying cry to end this session. I would like to thank my panelists. I hope all of you will join me in thanking them. Thanks so much. That was great. Thank you.